Hi, my name is Ari Miller with the USA Judo Coaches Education Committee. Today we'll be talking about the mental aspects of sports and performance. I'm joined here today with Performance Psychologist Dr. Matt Keener. Dr. Keener, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what a performance psychologist does?
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. So my name is Matt Keener. I am a psychologist with a background in performance. I spent a number of years working with elite athletes, military, and business professionals who are trying to work on the mental side of the game.
So how would working with a performance psychologist help an athlete or coach?
There's a number of things that athletes and coaches can do when working with a performance psychologist or mental performance. They include things like motivation, concentration, communication skills, managing injury, managing burnout, assisting with goal setting, visualization, and a variety of other things.
Dr. Keener, as a performance psychologist, what can you suggest that a coach focus on?
I think that a coach can focus on goal setting, arousal control, self-talk, and visualization.
Okay, so goal setting, I heard you once describe these as the big four. So let's break them down. Start with goal setting.
When it comes to goal setting, things that we can focus on, oftentimes coaches will focus on short and long-term goals. Short-term goals being a few days or a few weeks, long-term goals maybe being a season or years. We oftentimes focus on outcome goals when we're looking at those times. I want to be undefeated this season. I want to make a national team. I want to make an Olympic team. Sometimes we forget about process goals. I want to improve this one side of the game or this aspect or technique. So focusing on things like short-term goals, long-term goals, and outcome goals and process goals can be useful things that coaches can focus on.
Okay, so obviously outcome goals, like you said, making a team, winning a championship. Process goals, drilling a particular technique or adding a new technique to your repertoire that you want to use in future tournaments. Maybe getting in better shape. That's a big one, right? So what would you say would be the best way to measure these things?
Yeah, you started talking about goals that are specific, measurable, and attainable. I think that's really critical, along with tracking those goals. So where coaches can assist athletes is really with tracking those goals and accountability. So I often recommend that an athlete work on a goal and then present it to their coach and work with their coach on breaking down that goal into different pieces that are attainable throughout the season. But writing those goals down can be really critical and a way to maintain accountability and also track them.
Accountability, that's important.
Absolutely.
So I guess the more detail also, I think we're all guilty of it as coaches a little bit. We go through the process, maybe write a few things down, but I think the better documented performance journals, things like that, I guess could be very helpful.
Absolutely. Performance journals can be really helpful for just that quick tracking of progress throughout the season. But I think the coach can really assist the athlete with getting together and focusing on those journals, maybe at the end of every week, every 2 weeks, or every month, but keeping those performance journals after practice. And they can include things that are outside of the goal. How are you feeling today? How much sleep did you get the night before? How's your nutrition? So they can be very specific or they can be broad, depending on what the athlete's trying to work on.
Yeah, well, and I assume these things they build a bridge of trust also. You're asking an athlete how they are, you're learning something about them, but kind of bridging that gap that may be there also. That's good.
Yeah, it gets into trust and communication between the athlete and the coach. And I think you're setting the stage for those like pre-competition routines by having that good communication just about those goals.
Okay. And so regular meetings, I guess, with the athletes and discussing these things and the performance journal going over all these can be very helpful. What about arousal control?
Yeah, when it comes to arousal control, I think it depends on the type of arousal that is happening. So oftentimes when working with an athlete or a coach, the question becomes, are you over aroused or are you under aroused? And what does optimal arousal look like? So for some athletes, they really need to be amped up. For some athletes, they're too amped up and it's impacting performance. So when working with a performance psychologist, a coach or an athlete can really look at where is their optimal level of arousal. And usually I like to do that by asking an athlete to tell me, or a coach to tell me about their best performance, their optimal performance, and where was their mindset, where was their arousal. So there's two different types that I like to look at. Are they too aroused? Are they over aroused? Are they under aroused? And they need help with that. That makes sense.
Yes. So you can look back at tournaments. Again, goes back to keeping good records, writing as many things as you can down. And we're all guilty of that. All remember that and have it in our mind. And a week later, what was that I was trying to remember? But if you write it down at the time, that's a great way to look back and track, especially if you're at a tournament with more than one athlete. You have quite a few people that you're with. In order to remember these things, keep your own journal, write them down.
One thing that we had previously spoken about was coaches' levels of arousal and how to manage that, especially when they're over aroused, and how that can impact an athlete too. So I think those are important things to focus on. When the coach is over aroused, and maybe really anxious or really angry, and they're ineffective because it's filtering into that athlete. The athlete is picking up on it, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. Kind of like parents and children too, right? We're all guilty of this.
Absolutely.
You mentioned pre-match routines, pre-performance routines. How can they impact their performance, and what should coaches be doing or looking for pre-match routines?
Yeah. When it comes to pre-match routines, I think that there's pre-match routines, but when does that start? When does that match start? And I like to think back to even pre-practice routines. What is your mindset going into practice? What is your mindset going into matches? And how do you prepare for both? How do you prepare for practice, matches, and bigger tournaments? That can go back to important performance enhancing aspects like sleep, nutrition. As an athlete starts working up towards those bigger tournaments. When it comes to specifics of pre-match routines, like right before a match or maybe the hour before the match, my focus with an athlete is usually on where is that optimal level of arousal, and is it something cognitive that we need to work on? Is it self-talk, or is it maybe some breathing that we need to do to reduce their arousal if they're over-aroused? So it can be two different things, that self-talk and also potentially something physiological to reduce that arousal.
So if they're too amped up, more of a calming type approach as a coach, and like always positive.
Right. So when it comes to self-talk, for me, it's less about positive and negative and more about effective versus ineffective self-talk. So, and again, every athlete and every coach is going to be different in the self-talk that kind of gets them to that optimal mindset or that optimal performance. So one thing we can do with athletes or coaches is prior to a tournament, during the season, working on what are their performance statements, things that they can say to themselves that can help them with performance. So oftentimes these performance statements, I've heard you say, first grip, first throw. Am I getting that right?
First grip, first attack, finish everything. Yes, that came from my coach.
Right.
And I just pass it on every athlete before they go out on the match. First grip, first attack.
So I love that. Have you found that it's worked with your athletes or many of your athletes?
It seems to, and they just have this expectation where we have consistency, so to speak. So that's what I do, and maybe that's their trigger that, hey, I'm going out on the mat to perform.
Yeah, I love that. I think especially if it's effective. And the question is, and that's where you can go back to the performance journaling, did they notice that was effective as you stood behind them before they walked on the mat? Did they notice that that statement was helpful and it was able to cue them right before they went into competition.
Good stuff. And I know occasionally as coaches we end up in situations where we're coaching an athlete that we don't know as well. We get a call from another coach, or we're at an international event. You have a whole pile of people you don't know very well. And so that would come back down to, I said, communication, right? Ask them, hey, what do you need from me? And most of them will tell you. And it seems to be reassuring from a coach instead of going, I know everything. Hey, what do you need from me? Some of them just need, hey, I just want you to monitor the clock and tell me where I am. Sometimes I tend to start drifting. Help me get focused again. It seems to work really well.
I love that. I think brief, specific things that you can do, especially if it's with an athlete you don't know. I would try to be brief. I try to be very specific, but I would start with, as you said, what do you need from me? What works best with you? I've also heard you say to athletes, where is your head? I think that's a good prompt for them to be thinking about where is their self-talk, where is their potential anxiety going into this match. So good communication, and when you're doing an intervention, especially before a match, I'd keep it brief,
Okay.
and I'd keep it very specific.
You mentioned breathing. So for arousal control, can you touch on breathing a little bit?
Yeah, there's a number of different breathing techniques that we will have. I'll provide some resources for. But some of this breathing is as basic as box breathing, inhaling for 4 seconds, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, holding for 4, and repeating that 4 times. There are some things like the physiological sigh, which is a deep inhale, and then a shorter inhale after that. So there's a number of different breathing techniques that can be used to lower physiological arousal, especially prior to a match. But what I'll say, just like any of the techniques that we're talking about, the important aspect of this is really practicing it early and incorporating into practices, so when athletes get to those tournaments, they're prepared and it's something that they've practiced just as if they're practicing their throws or other aspects of their game.
Now that is a good point. You're not going to try a brand new technique for the first time ever at a tournament.
Right.
You will have drilled it, worked all the ins and outs. That is a good point, working on these things on a consistent basis, for sure.
Absolutely. Consistency is key, and making sure that it's not novel or new during the tournament or before the match, because actually that can just have some detrimental effects. So practicing it, and oftentimes when you look at practices, I think 95% is usually going to be considered on the physical skills, or focused on the physical skills. Very little oftentimes is going to be focused on the mental side. So that's usually what I'll do with coaches, is ask them how much of your practice time is dedicated to the mental side of the game. And I think it's an important thing for coaches to be thinking about and looking into.
No, that is a good point. And you read about it all the time, about things being, hey, it's only 20% physical, 80% mental, or whatever the numbers they use. But how much time are we actually spending to train those areas, to work on those areas? So, Dr. Keener, let's talk a little bit more about pre-match routines.
Absolutely. So pre-match routines, really, I like to consider it, go back further, pre-tournament routines, pre-preparation routines. It's really about that preparation prior to competition, which starts during practice. So where is your mindset? Where is your arousal? Where is your attention? Even walking into practice, it's going to be similar and should be similar to when you walk into that match and you walk into those tournaments.
Okay. And this runs the spectrum. Every athlete is different, right? So it comes down to knowing your athlete, communication. I've had highly technical athletes that are high performers that just wanted you to be there. So it was more about, hey, let's follow the plan, keep them focused. I've had some that need a little wake up. They like that slap on the back. I've had some that just kind of want to be in their own little world and listen to their music and focus there. So I just stand back. It seems like, I guess, again, communication is the key, understanding what each athlete needs.
Yeah, I think it goes back to communication, knowing what your athlete needs, and ensuring that they get to where they want to be in a safe and effective way. And the coach can do that by really knowing their athlete and communicating with them on what they need. I think you've probably had those experiences before on asking an athlete, what do you need from me? This goes back to the performance journal. Hey, as you're reviewing a journal 2 weeks after a big competition, what was going on with you when you didn't perform well? Or what was going on with you when you did perform well? What was my role there? Was I effective as a coach? What else could I have done for you to be more effective, if that makes sense?
Yes. So let's continue with these routines. During the day, these routines may change.
Absolutely, especially during long tournaments where they're going to have matches right in the morning, they're going to have matches in the afternoon, and they need to have some sustained focus. I think narrowing that focus down or when they need to be the most focused. Things like warm-up, incredibly important. They're going to have some downtime. What are they doing in each of those phases? But right before the match, how can you refocus them, especially if their mind starts to wander and their self-talk gets a little off track?
Okay. So for example, an athlete loses a previous match, they're still in the tournament. How do we get them focused again? Or an athlete that's thinking about getting their medal at the end and not necessarily about the task at hand. And my answer to them is always, what's your most important match? And they're kind of conditioned to say, the next match, coach, because that's what I say every time. Okay, that's all we need to focus on, your next match. That's the most important match right now.
I think that's great. You said a couple things that really stick out to me. One is when you say the most important match is your next match, the match that's coming up, you're really demonstrating like healthy bounce back and resilience. Like, hey, let's refocus on the next important thing that we have. But you're also talking about just good communication and motivation coming from the coach. And that goes to knowing your athlete and knowing what level of motivation and communication they need to get to where they need to be effective.
And that's great. And you've touched on that before, I think. Control what you can control. And that's what we can control, our next match, not what's going on in the future, not what happened before.
Absolutely. Control the controllables is something you'll hear from a lot of performance psychologists as a mental skill. It's control what you can control. You can control your warm-up. You can control how prepared you are, but you can't control who your opponent is necessarily, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. So Dr. Keener, these are things that every coach deals with, every athlete at some point deals with it. We affectionately call it the grind, embracing the grind or succumbing to the grind, so to speak. It's a tough sport. It requires lots of preparation. So what can we do as coaches to help our athletes get through these periods of burnout or when the grind just starts to wear them down?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to knowing your athlete and good communication with your athlete, and each athlete being different. Some athletes are going to be a little less susceptible to burnout depending on the pace. And again, it depends because they're all individual. So one thing that matters when it comes to burnout is coaches regularly checking in with their athletes. I've heard you say, where's your head at? We talked about before, which can really be helpful with understanding your athlete's level of motivation and burnout, because burnout is going to be linked but somewhat different than just overtraining and physical exhaustion. The psychological side of burnout is going to look like demotivation, not being as focused, not being as interested in the sport, which can lead, as many coaches know, to athletes quitting, unnecessarily so.
So I guess we need to continually help our athletes find a sense of purpose to push through these moments.
Absolutely. I think athletes understanding their why they were in the sport, absolutely matters. Obviously, it's based on development in some ways. If it's children, they're going to be different than adults, right? Kids are going to need a lot more fun mixed into practice to prevent that burnout. Athletes maybe a little bit less so, but they still need some variety in their practices and their competitions to ensure that they're managing that burnout effectively. But purpose absolutely matters, and helping athletes understand why they're there matters.
So for our high-level athletes, the athletes that are training very hard, it seems to be helpful when we have the whole club rally around them. When we're training hard, and I know that they're hurting and they're drifting a little bit, they're slowing down, where when everybody's going, hey, come on, Joe, come on, Bob, whoever it is, seems to get them going. It helps them refocus that sense of purpose. They're not just training for themselves, but there's a whole group behind them. For the kids class, we've had a lot of success, and I've learned this from one of my coaches, finishing with a game. They could have had an incredibly hard practice, even little kids. They work really hard, they're all sweaty, and we finish with this silly little game, and they walk out of the club smiling.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a bunch of important points. The social aspect of the club, I think, absolutely matters, and the coach promoting that social aspect to get behind, whether it's the kids in the game or whether it's adults getting behind their teammate to motivate them, I think is critical. So it's the coaches really focusing and recognizing that importance of that team environment and how that impacts motivation and potentially can work to decrease burnout matters.
And I think that's important. Some of the most successful teams that I've seen in history have had a central figure that brings everybody together. I've had a coach mention that I want my athletes to grow independently of me. You foster an environment where they're all working together, they're doing stuff on their own or with each other outside of the practice. We've talked about, hey, practice is the minimum standard. There's a lot of other things that you do in addition.
Yeah, the coach is a motivator, and really the coach as a leader, bringing together folks and saying, we need to develop this outside of me, and it needs to be, a leader on the team that helps promote that. I think that's critical.
So Dr. Keener, we've discussed performance considerations. What do we do when we see things rise to a level of distress?
It's a great question and critically important. The earliest signs of distress that a coach sees or teammates see, it's very important to ensure that the athlete gets to a licensed mental health professional.
So we've discussed things that coaches can do to help their athletes, but anybody can benefit from seeing a performance psychologist.
I think it's really important that utilizing performance psychology matters when it comes to, today we've talked about a broad range of topics, right? From self-talk to arousal control. But as I mentioned earlier, each athlete and each coach are different with regards to what they need. So I think actually seeing someone who is qualified as a performance psychologist can really help that individual athlete or coach achieve their optimal performance.
Well, great conversation. Thank you
Appreciate
for
it.
your time today.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.